Hi, I'm Mark Laux, Extension Weed Scientist with Ohio State University. It's June 18th, 2020, the middle of our great COVID crisis and the great dicamba controversy that's going on right now with court rulings. I'm standing in one of our research plots at the ORDC Western Research Station. And this particular study is the LLGT27 soybean, which has resistance to glyphosate and glufosinate or Liberty, and also has resistance to Isoxaflutole, which in corn we use Balance Pro. Isoxaflutole is the active ingredient. So there is a federal label for Isoxaflutole on this soybean at this point, although state labels and other things probably are not in order yet, and BSF really hasn't started promoting use of this yet in the soybean, but I suppose that's coming. This study gives you a little bit of picture of the activity of Isoxaflutole and where it might fit. Now we have a bunch of different pre-emergence soybean herbicides, and we have some good activity there. We also have lost a little bit of activity because of some ALS and some PPO resistance at water hemp and common ragweed and some species like that. So if you step back and look at what Isoxaflutole brings, and you can kind of think about, okay, where does that actually fit in the mix of those other herbicides? Isoxaflutole has, depending on rate, has some grass activity. It's 50, 60%, 70% grass activity in some cases. It's good on a number of broadleaf weeds. It has fairly substantial activity on ragweeds. I think we rated a 7 or an 8 on giant ragweed and the corn herbicides. It is rate dependent again, but giant ragweed is a weed that we really could use some additional pre-emergence activity on in another product that might fit there. And one reason for that is the only herbicides that really give us any residual activity on giant ragweed applied pre-emergence or ALS inhibitors like First Rate, which is in Sonic and some other products. Clemeron, which is in Valor XLT, Fierce XLT, Trivence, products like that, Scepter, and then we get some activity out of Pursuit as well. And the ALS activity renders a lot of that kind of void for people who have that particular resistance. So you run out of pre-options pretty fast. So when we start to think about Isoxaflutole in terms of where it has a fit to help us manage weeds, giant ragweed is one that pops up. Common ragweed, we have ALS and PPO resistance, so that limits in some cases what the Valor brings to help control ALS-resistant common ragweed. So again, that's another place where we could possibly have a fit. This study, it's paired with several different products to kind of see how it supplements that. I suppose there's situations where you could use the Elite 27, the Isoxaflutole, as your sole residual, but we probably wouldn't recommend that. You probably would be using it with something else to kind of get a broader range of activity and better activity on water hemp, maybe longer lived, a little broader spectrum activity. Water hemp is another weed that we start to lose some activity. We have PPO resistance, which starts to limit the effectiveness and how long our PPO inhibitors like Valor and Authority last on water hemp. So it definitely has a fit in there somewhere. If you look at this particular study, kind of start on my right here, it shows you what the weed pressure is. So it's one of the things that's happened in our trials out here at Western is a migration or a shift from just giant foxtail to a lot of yellow foxtail and barnyard grass, which they're more difficult to control, both from a post-emergence standpoint and then also pre-emergence herbicides start to lose some activity. So in this plot, there's a lot of yellow foxtail, there's some barnyard grass, there's giant foxtail. You can see there's a smattering of giant ragweed, and as you look at the whole plot around me and kind of see behind me, you can see there's more giant ragweed. The plots that we'll be looking at here in a second did get a burn down, and the burn down essentially worked on giant ragweed. So what you're looking at is weeds that came up after that point. There's actually a pretty nice mare's tail population in here, and that is one of the strengths. We've done some other work with the Isoxaflutole for residual mare's tail control, so when you burn it down and you want to not have to deal with it post-emergence. And Isoxaflutole, as far as we know, comes right to the top. It's one of the better residual products for residual mare's tail control as well. So it has a nice fit there. If you've tracked what we've talked about in terms of mare's tail, it's that it's difficult with any one single active ingredient to get enough residual control. So we've recommended pairing, for example, a Valor or an Authority product with metribuzin. And so Isoxaflutole would fit in there and could give us some really nice residual mare's tail control. So the two plots here on my left and my right are the Residual by itself, and this is a higher rate of Residual in this study, and then Isoxaflutole, the Elite 27 on my left, which is again the higher rate. This is a little bit of a tough grass population. Residual, of course, depending on rate, is a good grass herbicide, but you can see some grass coming through it. In this case, Residual, there is some maristale in here. Residual didn't get all the maristale. Residual has a little bit of maristale activity. You can see the Residual didn't do a whole lot for the giant ragweed, right? So then if you look at the pairing of Residual and the Isoxaflutole to my left here, you can see it helped out on the grass a little bit. And the grass is going to be cleaned up by whatever sprayed post-emergence in here anyway. So it helped out there because Isoxaflutole has some grass activity. There's not a maristale in here, I don't think. All the plots here that have Isoxaflutole on them, as far as I could tell in a rating, didn't have any maristale, so it did a really nice job. And you can see what Isoxaflutole brings here in terms of the giant ragweed control. Residual has essentially no giant ragweed control, and so what you're seeing here is essentially what the Isoxaflutole is bringing. And you can see there are a few in here. Again, we've got a pretty nice population of giant ragweed, so we would probably rate this like a 70% control plot. There's probably 5 or 6 in here that are about this tall, right, and then a few smaller ones coming, but it's not a bad start. We really rarely get better than about 70 to 75% control out of anything in soybeans for residual control of giant ragweed here, and that's where the classic and the first-rate products are still working. Behind me, we have a couple other different pairings where you can see a little bit, you can see this brought out a little bit more. So this particular plot is Boundary, and Boundary is a mix of dual and metribuzin. So you'd expect, again, it's a tough grass population, you'd expect pigweed control and grass control out of the dual that's in there, and then you'd expect the metribuzin to give you small seeded broadleaves, you know, again, pigweed, lamb's quarter, smartweed, and some of those. And that particular product has essentially no activity on giant ragweed, and you can see the population popped up a little bit here, just the variability. So you know, that's Boundary, and this particular population is not real strong. There is probably a little bit of maristale in here. Metribuzin sometimes has very good activity on maristale and sometimes doesn't, and it's rate and environment dependent. If you look at it paired with Isoxaflutole over here, and the cupping you see here is a little bit of dicamba movement from an adjacent plot, unfortunately. Again, you can see what the Isoxaflutole brings here. Helps out with grass, but really takes out a lot of the giant ragweed. In this case, again, we'd probably give this, given the population that's around us, especially right behind me here, I mean, that's probably a 70 to 80% giant ragweed control, which again is about as good as we get. And there's no maristale in the plot, and you can see a little bit of help with grass. The other comparison here, which is a little bit different, is putting Isoxaflutole with Sonic. Now, Sonic's a mix of first-rate and Authority. And so it's a pretty broad spectrum products. It's one of those type of products we use a lot of in Ohio, like Valor XLT, like Fierce XLT, like Trivence, those type of products. And the Sonic has good activity on giant ragweed. You know, that's one of those ones we could see 70 to 80% control out of here if we don't have ALS resistance, and we do have some, but it's kind of variable, and it's not really in this particular plot. So here you can see the Sonic by itself, really holding pretty well in this population, right? You've got it's not doing a lot for grass control, but it has taken out a lot of the giant ragweed. Again, there's a few in here, but this is good giant ragweed control. The population drops off a little bit, and there's no maristale in here from the Authority, and we're not getting a huge slug of maristale. I take it back, there's one right here, but we're not getting a huge flush of maristale in this study, which sometimes just comes breaking through, you know, Authority and Valor or metribuzin. And then you can see the Isoxaflutole plus the Sonic on my left here. You can see a little more giant ragweed, but that's sort of due to the giant ragweed population sort of surging there on that side of the plot. And in this particular case, as you look at it, you could make a case where adding Isoxaflutole to something like a Sonic or a Valor XLT would help you with water hemp and give you some better longevity and things like that. But in terms of you know, a Sonic or a Valor XLT or product or something like that, you know, the Isoxaflutole probably doesn't help that out as much as it does like a Boundary, you know, or just a straight Zidua or something like that. So it definitely has a fit. I think any conversation about Isoxaflutole, in this case the product's LLGT27 use in soybeans, you know, we have to come back to a couple things. One is we use a lot of HPPD inhibitors in corn. Isoxaflutole is an HPPD inhibitor, site 27. We use mesotrione, which is site 27. We use Laudis. We use Impact, right? And these particular beans are not resistant to all those different products, just the Isoxaflutole. But, you know, we talk about rotating herbicides and mixing herbicides to try to reduce the selection for resistance. And so I think a little bit of thought probably has to go into okay, if we're using a lot of PPD inhibitors in corn already, and we're going to continue to do that, do we need to use them in soybeans, or how do we use them in soybeans to make sure that we're not increasing our potential for the development of HPPD resistance? And in some cases you see it here where you're mixing it with something else, which definitely helps, but in other cases there might be some thought put into really just alternating and deciding, okay, I'm only going to use HPPD really every other year, and then that would have to be supplemented, as we recommend for water hemp and palmer amaranth especially, with later season scouting and removal of plants that might be going to seed.